So this last section is entitled Continuing Struggle. And it starts with African Americans and then goes through several different demographic groups and discusses kind of where we are now, where those groups are now. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about the struggle of African Americans, or as the book says, Black Americans. And there were several organizations that were working toward improving the position of African Americans in the United States. It is particularly egregious that the United States either tolerated or advanced chattel slavery in the United States and convinced themselves, mostly because it was convenient, and based on the writings of some Portuguese government people and some German people, and it was picked up by some English people, that indeed people that were from Africa were inferior. There were even theories that people that were from Africa might not exactly be human. There were also theories that the creation was only for people of European descent, and that there were basically two completely separate creations. And there were theories that people from Africa, or that the beings from Africa, weren't people at all, that they were closer to a completely different species. And all of that made its way, those writings, those understandings, those attitudes made their way around the world and made their way to North America's shores, into what would eventually become the United States of America. The whole concept of race is born out of necessity. It is science that came out of someone's head, and they wrote it down and assigned certain characteristics to people with origins from certain places. And it was never proven. A lot of experimentation was done to show that people of African descent could endure more pain, were superhuman, brains were smaller, all kinds of things. And that made its way and was passed down through the United States of America. So we talked about the NAACP that was formed at the beginning of the 20th century. And the NAACP really started to address issues of racism in the North, where African Americans were allowed to have jobs, were allowed to vote, but were deeply segregated and were prevented from getting some of the best jobs, and whose lives were in constant danger at a much higher rate. Eventually, the NAACP formed chapters in the South. We also saw and talked about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was formed in Alabama, and it was specifically designed to address racist laws, led by Martin Luther King Jr. There was also the Student Nonviolent something coalition. I always forget what the second C is for in SNCC. And eventually John Lewis became the president of that organization. They worked together and at the right time made sure that there were always pictures, that there was always reporting about what was going on in the South, because it was more overt. It was not only in the South, but it was much more vicious in the South. And Dr. King was very shrewd, and the community leaders and pastors that worked with him always made sure that when law enforcement acted up, that there was a picture, and that those pictures were seen, and that the bad actors were exposed. And it led to national attention. It led to a relationship with the new president, Lyndon Johnson. It led to the bus boycott. It led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It led to Dr. King eventually becoming a legend, although near his death he was becoming more and more unpopular because Dr. King had started moving into the North and addressing labor inequality, and not just for African Americans in the North. And so there were a lot of people that had been supporters of Dr. King that were starting to not support him. Today, poverty is still quite prevalent in the Black community. And as of the writing of this book, median household net worth by retired Black people was less than $20,000. And that is compared to roughly $200,000 for retired white people. Even when the jobless rate was at its lowest, it was consistently twice, jobless rate was consistently 2 times as high for African Americans. So there is a wide gap in income equality in the United States. There is, well, I'll just say this, roughly 35% of Black children live below the government-defined poverty line. The number for white children is 12%. And of course, that's relative because African Americans are 13% of the population, roughly 13% of the population, while Caucasians, whites, are, 56% of the population? And so 12% is a much larger number. The raw number, 12% of 56% of the population compared to 35% of 13% of the population. There are a lot more raw numbers, white children that are poor. But the percentages show a different number. More than half of Black children grow up in single parent families. About 1 in 10 grow up in a home where neither parent is present. Children who grow up in single parent households are more likely to have inadequate nutrition, not finish high school, not attend college, be unemployed as an adult, and spend time in prison. And if you really bring that forward, whatever the issue is, if unemployment is high, it hits the Black community at a much higher rate, much harder rate. If a disease that preys on pre-existing conditions is going around, African Americans are more likely to live in poverty, or more likely to not have quality health care, and both of those contribute to having pre-existing conditions. African Americans are more likely to live in neighborhoods where the air quality and water quality are not great, which leads to birth defects and conditions, which leads to being more vulnerable to diseases like COVID-19. Now, definitely, if you compare 2020 to 1950, 1960 even, the plight of African Americans is better. The trajectory for African Americans is better. There are no longer, or very few, locations where people are bold enough to try to have segregated facilities. Schools are not segregated. African Americans are able to go to large Division I schools for academics and for athletic ability, and are no longer excluded from professional sports. So things are better, but there is that history. And we've seen this year things come front and center. And it's kind of been, this little projection from Sandra Bland here in Texas to Michael Brown in Missouri, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, George Floyd in Minnesota, Eric Garner in New York. We have images burned into our brains of African Americans being the victims of police brutality. And I guess I should not forget a Tatiana Jefferson here in Fort Worth, and Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. It is an interesting existence to be an African American in the United States. African Americans have seen financial gains overall. African Americans have seen gains in holding office, but there's still voter suppression. There is still a fear of African Americans. There is still, that translates to something that makes law enforcement much more likely to be afraid and to react adversely to an African American than to someone that's not African American. African Americans still have hold a disproportionate number of spots in prisons and jails. So we had a black president, not someone that came from a slave tradition. Um, Barack Obama was or is Irish, basically, um, and Scottish, and his dad was from Kenya. But we basically in the United States put anybody who has direct connections or dissension from Africa in some way, we call them black. It's just a label anyway. Kamala Harris is the daughter of an Indian immigrant from India. Her mom came to the United States when she was 19, and her dad is from Jamaica. And then at some point, people made it to Jamaica from Africa. So she is our first black vice presidential nominee. And it looks like she is going to be our first female vice president. Let's talk about the strides that women have made. So, for years in the United States, the women's movement was inextricably tied to African Americans. In fact, many women worked tirelessly to help abolish slavery. But even in that effort, they found that sometimes women would go to meetings that were like the Abolitionist Society, and they weren't allowed to participate or even sit on the floor. And so a couple of women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, were sitting up in the balcony at an anti-slavery society convention because they weren't allowed to be on the floor, and they started really thinking about, what is this? How is our plight that much different than someone that is enslaved? We can't own property. We have no real rights. We can't vote. If somebody decides that they want to be abusive, nobody's going to say anything about it. And as they sat there, they started plotting, and they planned a convention, a women's convention. They called it the Women's Rights Convention. It was held in Seneca Falls, New York. That's definitely going to be on the quiz. And as they continued to work, they adopted a platform. It called for the end of slavery. It called for women to be able to get the right to vote. It called for the abolition of the sale of alcohol, or prohibition. When the Civil War was over and the new amendments, Reconstruction amendments, were being worked on, when they wrote out the 15th Amendment and gave the right to vote, it was not extended to women. Women did not get the right to vote until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed. The movie clip that I have given you to watch from Iron Jawed Angels really kind of chronicles, and that's an excellent movie to watch all the way through, chronicles the leaders of that movement that eventually led to the ratification. I think Tennessee was the last state, and giving women the right to vote. So there were many women activists, female activists, that thought that the equal rights provision that was listed in the 14th Amendment should have included women. And so they actually introduced an amendment that has been called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. It was initially introduced in 1923. It was finally decided or voted on by Congress in the 70s, and it never got 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. There has been legislation that is designed to assist women. One of them is the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And it definitely said that you could not pay someone a different salary based on their gender. In 1972, the Civil Rights Act of 64 was amended to include Title IX. Title IX said that you can not, no school that is accepting any federal money, and just about every school is, can discriminate on the basis of gender. So if you have to try to achieve parity or get as closely as you can. If you have male sports, if you have male only sports, you have to have an equal number of female sports. If you're giving scholarships for male athletes, then you have to work at giving an equal number of scholarships to female athletes. So this has increased, good heavens, exponentially, the number of young ladies that participate in sports. And sports in the United States has boomed. I told you guys I went to the Olympics in 2016, and boy, the American women were whooping up on everybody. Basketball, the tennis, and certainly track and field, swimming, and all of that is because you really could, with your athletic talents, excel. And so women started to get better and better. In 1974, a lot of it because of the efforts of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the ACLU division, the Equal Credit Act was passed. there were there was still by that time a tendency not to grant credit to women separate from their husbands. And what about if you're not married? Um, and so that was prohibited in 1974. Despite all of this effort, and I guess we cannot forget the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Women still do not make equal pay. It's still 80%, 82% of that of male employees. Women's groups continue to press for comparable worth policies, um, continue to press to be considered for the highest positions, still have not um, broken the what we call the glass ceiling. It's something you can't see, but when you try to get past it, you just can't seem to get past it. We've never had a woman president, or just now in 2020, having a female vice president. Much less involvement in politics. And we talked about single parent families and that connection with poverty. And most single parent families are headed by women. 1 in 3 of those single parent families live below the poverty line. This is known as the feminization of poverty. So there is a graphic. Poverty is 5 times higher among female-headed households than among two-parent households. Women now have achieved substantial gains in offices. Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed as the first female justice on the Supreme Court. 1981, that would have been Ronald Reagan. Geraldine Ferraro was Walter Mondale's running mate. She was the Democratic Party vice presidential nominee, and Walter Mondale did not win. We've never had a President Mondale. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was the first woman to head a major party's national ticket. And she did not win, even though she was eminently qualified, but just people did not like her. And it says women hold less than 1 in 4 congressional seats, but good heavens, in 2018, we had a record number of women. And again, in 2020, a large number of women. The Republican Party has been seeing the biggest gains in females, but there are large numbers of women are members of our Congress in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And hey, we're not at the bottom for percentage of legislative seats held by women. Oh, goodness. the, even as I discuss what happened to African Americans, and we can't sugarcoat it. It was ugly. United States needs to be embarrassed, um, and needs to apologize. But the other side of the story, as Europeans were coming from the Netherlands and from Germany and from England, uh, and from France, is that they were systematically taking land, at first negotiating and then taking land from the people that actually were here. Native Americans' population decreased from 5 to 10 million. And by 1900, Native Americans numbered less than 1 million. As the United States set up its government, they put in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress had the ability to negotiate with Indian tribes. And the reason that they did that is because they treated members of tribes as if they were separate nations, and did not grant citizenship, the ability to vote, to Native Americans in American society in the land that had been theirs before the Europeans came until 1924. 1924. There were many, many Native Americans that served in every war and fought with and for the United States, but were not granted citizenship until between the First World War and the Second World War. 1968, there was something that was called the Indian Bill of Rights. It basically provided constitutional guarantees for Native Americans on reservations. Reservation means that the land is reserved for your tribe, and you get special treatment. You are basically considered a dual citizen. So you still are a citizen of your tribe, and if you live on a reservation, they still negotiate with the United States through treaties. But you are also a United States citizen, so you have dual citizenship. And so in some of those agreements, these agreements override state law. So there is the ability to have gambling on reservations, even if gambling is not legal in the state where the reservation is located. Policing and benefits are all come directly from the federal government. And make no mistake about it, the United States government, either through negligence or through direct action, exterminated large numbers of Native Americans. Made treaties with them and said, hey, you get to have this land, you let us have this land over here, you get that land over there, and then came back and said, yeah, we were just kidding. We need that now. And if there was resistance, then there were wars. Systematically relocated Native Americans from all over the United States. and something that is called the Trail of Tears. The United States government was forcing tribes, and they were just the great grand idea was that they were just going to locate everybody in Oklahoma. uh, hmm. So there have been a series of protests, um, including 1972, the Trail of Broken Treaties protests. In 1973, there was a standoff in South Dakota, the Wounded Knee standoff. More recently, we have seen protests where the United States government was looking to put in a pipeline right on reservation property or reserve property, and there were protests. There, Native Americans have and do experience voter suppression. Native Americans have the highest rate of alcoholism, diabetes, depression, and highest poverty rate. So today, full-blooded Native Americans, including Alaska Natives, number more than 2 million. Half live on or near federal reservations. And again, the negotiations with reservations is with the chief, and is in the form of a treaty like a foreign nation. State governments can't do or order anything on the on reservations, which is good and bad, because that also means that law enforcement won't go on reservations, that is a federal responsibility. That also means that state, well, we'll just leave it there. There are all kinds of services that are offered through states that tribal members are not able to take advantage of if they live on reservations. That comes directly from the federal government. If the particular tribe has negotiated and has the ability to have casino gambling on their reservation, then all of the proven, and they actually do blood like what percentage of this particular tribe do you have, then you are able to actually share in the profits from the casinos. The federal government also gives you scholarships and health care. And a lot of that is because the Bureau of Indian Affairs stole some money, just used the money for other things that was set aside and specifically for the use and benefit of tribes. And so basically, if you are able to prove that you are a certain percentage of a particular tribe and can trace it, then you are entitled to some extreme benefits, for what that's worth. Hispanic Americans, good heavens. So this is really a very large group. The census started identifying Hispanic Americans, I believe, in 1980. And it is on the census, it's something that you self-identify. And bottom line, the Spanish made their way through North America Central America, South America, and many locations in the Caribbean, and spread their language and their customs and their religion and their seed through those areas. And so many of the indigenous people in these locations eventually started to speak Spanish as their primary language, had Spanish surnames, and many of the cultures are basically a combination of those Spanish settlers and indigenous people. Now, like if in Brazil, there is a very, very strong indigenous culture that is maintained and is protected. In a lot of locations, how though there is only that new culture that emerged as the Spanish made their way through, and really all that is left is these new cultures, that are a mix of indigenous people and Spanish people. So really it anyone who immigrated to the United States from one of those locations, from Mexico and North America, any country in Central America, any country in South America, or any Caribbean island, that identifies as Hispanic. You know who doesn't identify as Hispanic? People from Spain. But honestly, if that's the definition, though, then this is a group that has been in North America the longest. The Spanish colonized Florida, New Mexico, California, Arizona, and Texas. I don't know why they have Texas left out. And all up Oregon way. It was a large part of the southern and western part of what we call the United States. And even after this basically new group of indigenous people and Spanish people, this new group were able to secure their independence from Spain and formed the United States, Mexican United States is what they will call it. Then there was still a very, very heavy Spanish culture, and they were the government. They were the landowners. So in many parts of the United States, Hispanic Americans are the oldest ethnic group, if you really think about that. And even after a couple of wars where Mexico was kind of losing property, at some point Mexico said, here, this property up here, we're just going to give it to the United States. And so the people that were living there were all of a sudden United States citizens. But they didn't move. The border just moved. Hispanics are a fast growing minority in the United States. They are certainly the largest racial or ethnic minority group. I really believe that Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority in the United States. There have been several efforts to just achieve equity And while African Americans have the NAACP and the Legal Defense and Education Fund, there is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. There is LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens that fight for civil rights. In the kind of from the late 40s through the mid 70s, there was the American GI Forum headed by Dr. Hector P. Garcia that all were fighting for rights for Hispanic Americans. And it depends on what part of the country you're in. Certainly you were going to find in Texas and Arizona and California and New Mexico, a large percentage of the Hispanic population are from Mexico. Proximity, families have been there for years. Were there before there was a Texas. In Florida and on the East Coast, you are much more likely to find people of Puerto Rican descent. And of course, you know, Puerto Rico is a territory, so that's not a foreign country. It's a United States territory, so they are American citizens. From Cuba. And then there are, of course, people from Nicaragua, from Ecuador, from El Salvador, that have migrated to the United States and make up a very diverse Hispanic population in the United States. There, despite many promises and despite people having been on their property and land for years, there has definitely been marked disrespect of Hispanic people in the United States. In Texas and California, there were segregated schools. In Texas, they were called Mexican ward schools. And so you could not go to a white-only school. You had to go to the Mexican ward school, and they were very poorly funded. Oftentimes, they were multi-grade in one room. And even when schools integrated, so the first lawsuit was Westminster case in California, and a young lady sued because they would not allow her aunt to enroll her in the school that was near her house because she was Hispanic, and she sued, and that case goes up to the Supreme Court and won, and so they California was ordered to desegregate their schools as far as Hispanics were concerned. This was 1948, the Westminster case was. And so as you can imagine, Thurgood Marshall wrote a brief and tracked that case and used a lot of the language from the Westminster case when he did the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case. This was before Earl Warren was on the Supreme Court, but Earl Warren was the governor of California before he was on the California Supreme Court. And when California desegregated, they wrote the law that desegregated their school system. He was the governor that signed the law. So he and Thurgood Marshall went way back. And the prototype, what they did in that Westminster case, was the prototype for desegregating all schools. Well, Hispanic income is substantially below the national average, if we're looking overall. And more than 4,000 Hispanic Americans hold public office. Um, we have Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who serves on the Supreme Court and is the first Hispanic member of the Supreme Court. Definitely many of the presidents were like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were instrumental in making sure that there were more and more Hispanic appointees within the federal court system. Traditionally, Hispanic Americans have had very low voting rates. That was not true in 2018. We saw Hispanic voting rates go way up. They stayed up in 2020. And it seems to be buoyed more by young Hispanic Americans across the spectrum, Mexican American, Puerto Rican if they are on the mainland, from El Salvador, from Nicaragua. The voting rates for young Hispanic people have gone way up. And so in 2018, the city, Tarrant County, which has traditionally always gone for the Republican candidate, voted for Beto O'Rourke. And it looks like, if the numbers hold, and I think they pretty much have, Tarrant County went for the Democratic candidate Joe Biden in the 2020 election. So we are seeing a shift, although while African Americans are about 90% are Democrats, Hispanic Americans about 65%, and that certainly held true in this election. Maybe even a little bit more, but only 65% are Democrats. Asian Americans. So again, we are talking about several countries and lumping immigrations or immigrants or descendants of immigrants from several countries into one big umbrella that we call Asian Americans. There was a large influx of Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants that came to the United States when the United States started in building its railroads and mines in earnest in the late 1800s. And so they are basically responsible for making the United States a superpower, because once they were able to mine coal and able to get goods from sea to shining sea because of those railroads, the United States began to become a huge producer. And we have those laborers to thank for that. Nonetheless, in 1892, the United States Congress tried to, or no, actually did suspend Asian immigration. Specifically, it was called the Chinese Immigration Act. And those restrictions, either there were only a certain amount of people could come from countries from Asian countries, really stayed in place in some form until 1965. In California, where there were larger concentrations, especially of Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants, there were segregated schools. And so eventually, the segregated schools were phased out, and students were all going to the same schools. But in 1974, and this is primarily in California, but bilingual instruction was basically they ordered that if a child does not have English as their native language, you are going to need to speak to them and teach them in their native language as they become English speakers. Don't stunt their development by forcing them to speak a language that they don't speak at home. You have to ease the students in. In California, you have to have someone that speaks whatever the native language is of every student in the school. And they sometimes have difficulty hiring teachers that speak the myriad languages that the students speak. Asian Americans now number about 12 million. Higher concentrations on the West Coast, particularly in California still, but definitely not only there. Asian Americans are an upwardly mobile group. They're not very politically active, at least they have not been heretofore. So there's kind of a race to the bottom between Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans. And I don't know if this is true, but we're gonna just read what the book said. Most Asian cultures emphasize family-based self-reliance with an emphasis on education. That seems to be so. Not a whole bunch of emphasis on political participation, though. Asian American families are much more likely to have two-parent families of any racial group. And in that, just tying everything together, highest median family income. Again, not a lot of political participation. Not as much representation as you would think in higher level jobs. When it comes to making the decisions and deciding who's going to be promoted, often Asian Americans are overlooked. But Asian Americans, if we're talking straight finances, have the highest median family income of any group. So if we compare 1950 to 2010 and look at where immigration came from primarily in 1950, when there were restrictions on immigration from Africa, from Asian countries. 1950, 78% of the people that were migrating to the United States were coming from Europe and Canada, and only 3% from Asia, 16% from Latin America. There were restrictions on Latin American immigration as well. In 2010, this stops at 2010, 11% of immigrants were from Europe and Canada, 35% were from Asia, and 53%, I don't know, that doesn't equal 100. Close. Were from Latin America. So our immigration patterns have changed quite a bit. Now, nobody is immigrating to the United States right now. Nobody wants to be here. we can't. We're having a little bit of trouble. So we're not seeing large scale immigration in 2020. If you look at states and minority population, just notice that those states in the South and West that are nearest to Mexico and are much more likely to have families that are in Mexico, or families that were in Mexico and then they're just reconnecting. That's California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida. And then up in Nevada, in New York. And the Midwest states are much less likely. Midwest and far Northeast, like New Hampshire and Vermont, are much less likely to have minority populations, high minority populations. Civil Rights Act of 1964 classified women and minorities as legally protected groups. Over time, other groups have been added to protection. Um, Age Discrimination and Employment Act was passed in 1967, and the Age Discrimination Act of 19 was passed in 1975. Age is not a protected class, and age usually only gets the rational basis test. That is also true of Americans with disabilities. However, there was in 1975 the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Children Act, and so that made sure that there was education for sight challenged, hearing challenged, cognition challenged children in public schools. And still today, if the school is not providing adequate instruction, you number one, can get accommodations so that they are able, if they're able to do the school work with accommodations, then you work with the school to make sure that they are giving those accommodations. And if the school really just cannot meet the needs of the student, parents can get the federal government and the state government to pay for their child to go to some place that can. All of that is born out of that 1975 act. And then, of course, there's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that required all buildings that are open to the public to make themselves accessible to a myriad of people with disabilities, sight challenge, hearing challenge, wheelchairs. And so you have to have braille, you have to have wider stalls, you have to have elevators, and the federal government, when they enforced the ADA initially, did not give any money to businesses or to state and local governments to make these accommodations, and you just had to find the money in your budget, and if you didn't do it, then you got fined. So it was an unfunded mandate. Recently the Supreme Court decided that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually does apply to transgender to gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals. You can't fire someone just because they are because of their sexual orientation or their gender identification. That was this year that the case was, and I don't even know what the case is. We have in the past in the United States barred gays and lesbians from military service. Um, and then we had a policy that was called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." So they didn't ask you if you were a homosexual, but if they found out you were a homosexual, you could be discharged, dishonorably discharged. And finally, under the Obama administration, they just stopped all of it altogether, and would allow transgendered individuals to serve in the military. And then the Trump administration barred or attempted to bar transgender individual men and women from military service. So I don't know what's about to happen. It has been interesting to watch. We talked a little bit in when we were talking about the right of privacy. We talked about the Lawrence versus Texas case, and the end of anti-sodomy laws. And the really big thing was in 2015 when the Supreme Court heard Obergefell versus Hodges and said that it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause to ban granting marriage licenses to same-sex couples. We're still seeing open defiance in many states. The Texas Attorney General has told justices of the peace that if they have a religious objection, they don't have to marry. And so while it is the law of the land, we're still seeing bits and pieces of lack of enforcement. I have a friend that just recently got married in the Waco area, and she said that she couldn't find a justice of the peace that would marry she and her girlfriend, who she used to always introduce as her friend. I'm like, that's not your friend. But she ended up finding a church, and the church was very friendly, and they ended up getting married in that church. But man, so not a protected class. So definitely not strict scrutiny, not rational not even intermediate scrutiny, which seems to be reserved for gender, and rational basis, but have seen some court victories recently. Attitudes have changed about the concept of same-sex marriage, where it was a huge deal when I was in high school. It just is not as much anymore. And so we're up over, headed towards 70% in 2017, and I'm sure even higher now, although we may see some rollbacks because we do have a very conservative Supreme Court. So America has a very high opinion of itself. You often hear people say, "This is not who we are. This is not who we are." But remember back at the beginning when Abraham Lincoln said that we are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But it is an idea. And I think that America really still doesn't really understand who we are. When we say this is not who we are, really? Who are we then? Who are we then? And since we are not willing as a nation to take a real good look at ourselves. As soon as we start talking about history, then people are like, that's in the past, that wasn't me, and don't want to really address the issues. And so the problems persist because we refuse as a nation to really, really address. We we saw this past year as I watched things unfold, and just the different reactions of people astonished me. It's like, how could we be this far apart? At some point, um, America is going to have to come to grips with its history, so that we can move on together. And so when we say this is not who we are, it can be true and we can really mean it. Hopefully that will be sooner than later.